So Tapestry, I'm an artist, and I've been a Christian since 1990, somewhere around there. And early on, well, let me just start with this. I had an uncle by the name of George that, whenever I was a teenager, would come around our house, and he was trying to get us to have an experience with Christianity, and I never did. But one day he popped his head into my room and was like, he says, and at that time I was doing a lot of really intense drawings off of these really heavy metal record album covers that I was into. So they were pretty. Some of them were pretty intense. He used the term satanic, and I would say probably they were. But he popped his head and he's like, "Hey, why are you always drawing for the devil?" And I was like, "What?" And then he goes, "You should draw for God." And I was like, "What?" And then he left, and he didn't explain anything, and I had no context for that. So after I became a Christian, I wanted to do that. I wanted to use artwork, and I really couldn't find a place for that, not a really good place for it. I became a graphic designer, was able to use that and all that, but this fine arts part of me, I felt like there wasn't really a place for it. So Tapestry was kind of born out of this idea that the gifts that I have are what I want to use to express God to the people around me. I believe that art is spiritual, and if you're not approaching it even from a Christian perspective, but just from a human perspective, there is something about art that has an intrinsically spiritual value to it. And here's what I mean by that, is when I create artwork, or somebody creates artwork, it touches our emotions, and that reaches beyond just our physical. That can touch your soul, you know? And I think that if something can touch your soul, then it should be able to lead your spirit. One of the things, if you're looking at the way that we format Tapestry, we do call it Tapestry Art Church, and that's not just a moniker that we came up with. It literally, what we're trying to do is, we have concepts like, right now we're developing our next series, which is called Maker's Gonna Make, and we're looking at Genesis, which is talking about creation. Instead of just coming at it from a theological perspective, which of course we're going to have that, but when we have our time together, we get together, we do our worship music, poetry, dance, whatever we're going to be doing that night. And then instead of somebody getting up and just lecturing, which is pretty typical and not wrong, but instead of doing that, we're actually going to have artists that in advance have created a piece of artwork that expresses that concept that night. Mm-hmm. So instead of somebody just getting up and talking, you're going to have an artist that's going to be able to bring a piece of work that's been inspired by the text, and then that piece of work actually becomes the message. And that was the whole thing with Tapestry, was I'm looking for a way for art not to be a vehicle that is for something more important, per se. Like, most of my experience as an artist working in the church has been, I'm creating this image so that it supports the message. Whereas with Tapestry, the concept's a little different in that we're creating the image as the message. Mm. And that's the important part of it. And I feel like that, and not just images, that concept could be expressed in whatever way artistically. It could be poetry or music or visual art, dance, short film, however. So whatever way that you're wanting to express that as an artist, then you can. And I think that the reason why that I find that so important is because if you're passionate about art, and whatever art you're passionate about, and you come to an organization, and in this particular case it's the church, and there's no place for you because you don't have the very narrow skill set that is typically employed in that organization, then that organization is not as important to you. But if you can come into a group, and I think this is why a lot of communities kind of gather up around something, is because they all have this common denominator, like whether it's Vanguard, a card game, or Dungeons and Dragons, or church, or small groups. A lot of times, if you really look at it, they're based around something. Like with church, obviously it's around scripture, around a common love for Jesus, or, there's this community that builds up around that. And I want to do that, but at the same time, I want people that maybe have been on the fringes that have these giftings that have not been employed because there's not really a place for them, to be able to say, oh, well, here's a place for me. I can come in, I can use my gifting, and the space is not as narrow. And what I mean by that is that most typically, and this is not bad, I'm not saying this is bad, in most mainstream modern American churches, the arts are involved, and it's basically music. And then you have some graphic design, and once or twice a year there's drama, like around Easter or Christmas. There's places, and it's beautiful. And I'm not saying anything against that, but what I'm saying is there could be more, right? It's like you've got, I use the example, a 500 watt amp, and we're using like 2 watts. And there's all, 498 more watts to go. And so I want to be able to have a place where artists can be like involved. And maybe somebody that doesn't really even know that much about scripture, maybe that's somebody that's not a lifelong Christian, but this is what I found over the years, that sitting down with people that are not like theologians and really deep, knowledgeable in those areas, but are just looking at something for the first time in a fresh way, a lot of times can bring a lot of insight to that. And as an artist, being able to take a text, like I'll give you an example. This is the piece that I'm going to be creating for the next series called Maker's Gonna Make. The scripture says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of the Lord hovered above the face of the waters. And that is so poetic. And that's the other thing about Tapestry, is that we're approaching the scripture as truth, but also as art. And there's so much in scripture that's artistic. The whole thing is artistic. Especially if you're looking at the King James Version of the Bible, that's all written in poetic verse because it's easier to remember. But anyways, that's an aside. So here's the concept that I have for the piece of artwork that I want to create for that one, and if I can pull it off. So the Spirit of the Lord hovered above the face of the waters. And I think that the beauty of art is that you can incorporate mystery into a piece of work. And so here's this very beautiful line, and the Spirit of the Lord hovered above the face of the waters. You just say that, and it's just like, oh, that's awesome. And so you think that it's dark, because the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and it's still, and it's just this intense moment. So here's the idea. I'm going to get a big piece of black mirror, right? Something reflective that's black, and put a thin layer of water on top of it somehow, right? So I've got to figure this part out. And then I'm going to take some kind of cloth, maybe like cheesecloth or some really thin cloth, and I'm going to sculpt a face and dip that into acrylic so that it hardens, but clear, just the face. And then suspend that over the top of that reflective piece of glass, but then have that really thin ephemeral material just kind of hovering out away from it, suspended.
Oh, wow. That'd be really...
and so when you think about
really
that,
crazy.
You're like, now, I think what happens a lot of times with all religions, Christianity, any religion, and even secular concepts, politics, whatever, a lot of times what we're trying to do is we're trying to take our idea and make you listen to it, and push it in your face. And there's a place for that. Sometimes you have to be, you can't shy away, and you have to be willing to put it out there. But at the same time, I think what's more effective is when you create something and people look at it and go, what's this about?
Yeah.
And I think that Tapestry, the idea behind Tapestry is to create a space where when people walk in, they go, what's this about?
Yeah.
Within Tapestry structure, we have this thing called commissioning, where we actually commission work to an artist. So like say Benjamin, you say, well, I want to do, this really speaks to me, day 3, in the creation story. I want to do this piece. Okay, well the commission then to you is represent that concept. It's not you believing it or anything like that. It's you taking that, reading it, understanding what it's trying to say, and then using that as an inspiration to create a piece of work that represents that thing. That's commissioning. Because then you're not just creating work because you want to create a piece of work. You're actually trying to convey something.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you don't agree with it, I've been hired to do work that I had no feeling for or against, and then I've done some work that I probably wouldn't do if I was doing it. But I was hired or commissioned to do that work, and so I did the work. And so, but at the same time, somebody that maybe doesn't have a relationship with Scripture, and because when you create artwork, I think it was said earlier, it's something from you. It's who you are. You're blending this into yourself in order to get it out. And so I think the beauty of Tapestry is that it gives the opportunity for people that may not have had that opportunity to have a relationship with Scripture to interact with it in a way that's very intimate.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is one of the most important parts of Tapestry to me, is that it's an opportunity for an artist to intimately interact with Scripture in a way that they are able to bring inspiration out of it and then give inspiration to other people, right? And here's the beauty of the word inspiration. It's actually, the word spire is a family of words, like conspire, inspire, perspire, expire, all of those. And the spire part of that word is to breathe. And so when you inspire, you breathe in, right? When you perspire, you breathe through. When you conspire, you breathe together. And so Tapestry, I feel like the whole thing is that we're trying to inspire or to breathe in so that we can conspire to breathe together, so that we can share that breath with the people around us. Because it's a breath of fresh air when you come into a place that is bringing a positive message, but using artwork to do that. It's amazing. It's like, like when a band comes together to play music, and they do it really, really well. It's moving. They call it a piece of music is called a movement for a reason. In the Middle Ages and in the early church before the Reformation, art was a really big part of the church. If you look at the Sistine Chapel, if you go to Rome and a lot of those places, they hired a lot of the reason why a lot of artists even survived is because the church had them on retainer. They were paying them to be artists, but their artwork was actually also in the church. And some of the most famous and long-lasting artists were people painting in the church and painting the church. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because in that era of time there was a lot of illiteracy. The common people didn't read, right? And in some places it was actually illegal for common people to read, but they could see, most of them. And so then artists were actually representing truth through painting and sculpture, so that people could see it without having to read it. Mm. That's amazing. Here's the thing about art in the church is that a lot of times we're thinking in terms of right and wrong, when we shouldn't be thinking in terms of right and wrong. We should be thinking in terms of good or better, right? Having some art in the church is good. Having more art in the church is better. Well, I think the other thing too is we're really focusing a lot on visual arts, but like musicians like Benjamin, I know you're a musician, and Nathaniel's also a musician. Being able to express yourself through your music, and a lot of times if you're writing a song, obviously the meaning of it's coming across because you wrote it into there. But sometimes you just write a piece of music that is just instrumental, and being able to explain that to somebody is really, really awesome. And I think the thing about art is, one of the things I learned, because I did go back to school, I'm just a few credits short of a degree in fine art. And one of the things that we talked about in our art theory class is that when you create a piece of work, as soon as you make it public, then you no longer own it. You can't own the definition of it. The thing about Tapestry, though, is because we are creating work that is concept-based, the first presentation we get to own. After that, no.
Mm-hmm.
But when that person gets up to explain their work and their inspiration and what they're trying to convey, there's a lot of beauty in that, because a lot of times artists don't get a chance to talk their work. And that's a really big part of Tapestry, is the artist talking their work. Sometimes it's because they don't know how, which I want to help them do that. And I want to sit down with them and say, okay, here's your work, tell me about it. And if they're like, well, I really don't know how, then I'm going to say, okay, well then let me help you, because you're going to have to talk this work in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, you know?
Yeah.
So let's work on that. And then I want to teach them how to do that, because it's important. You know, I've done a lot of gallery shows. I've showed in galleries all across the country. And one of the very important things is being able to be available to talk to people about your work, especially if you're trying to sell work. Because people want to know, well, what does this mean? You know.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of times. One of the things that I like to do when I do gallery shows is to stand back, where I'm close enough to listen to people talking about the work, but they don't know that I'm the artist. I love that, because a lot of, like, 9 times out of 10, they're not thinking the way I. Their interpretation wasn't my idea, but sometimes theirs is better, you know. And there's been a few times that they were totally wrong, and I've stepped in and said, actually, that's not what I was going for. Let me explain it to you. And they're like, oh, really? Oh, yeah. I think that's the thing is that we're able to convey a message in a way that is palatable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people can come in, and like you said, even if they're not religious, they can get something from it and be inspired. And that's the most important thing, is I want people to be inspired, to say, well, I could do that. You know, I can draw for God. Because now